"Dad, the floor is turning into glass," Leo whispered, his breath visible in the sweltering August heat. Elias watched in horror as a jagged, blue shard of ice punched through his living room floor, dismantling the home he'd spent his life paying for. The injustice was bitter. The city had dismissed his warnings about the hollow ground for years. Now, a prehistoric glacier was exhaling a 10,000-year-old breath into his hallway, and something dark was twitching inside the ice. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support means the world and helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Stick with us until the end, and if this mystery moves you, share your thoughts in the comments and pass it along to a friend. The summer of 2024 was a brutal, sweltering stretch in Ohio that turned every lawn into a brittle shade of tan. Elias Miller wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, his knuckles white as he gripped a flashlight in his dark, humid basement. He was a man of logic and blueprints, an engineer who spent his days ensuring things stayed upright and level. But as he stood on the cracked concrete floor, the air felt wrong. It wasn't just the usual cool of a subterranean room. It was a sharp, aggressive chill that bit at his skin, cutting through the heavy August heat. He'd noticed the first hairline fracture in the north retaining wall a week ago. He'd chalked it up to the house settling, a minor grievance of suburban life. But the injustice of the situation began to settle in when his youngest son, Leo, stopped playing in the basement altogether. The boy complained that the floor made his feet feel like they were turning into glass. Elias knelt down, his knees popping in the silence. He clicked the light on. The beam hit the wall and scattered across, something sparkling. It wasn't water. It wasn't dampness from a summer storm. It was frost. Thick, white, jagged ice was blooming across the concrete like a winter flower in the middle of a 90-degree afternoon. He reached out, his fingers brushing the surface. The sting was immediate, a deep, bone-deep cold that made his nerves scream. This was an impossibility. The soil outside was baked dry, the water table was low, and yet, here was a localized Arctic front pushing through his foundation. He stood up, his heart thumping a jagged rhythm against his ribs. The mystery wasn't just the ice, it was the pressure. The concrete was bowing inward, the structural rebar groaning under a weight that shouldn't exist. The gossip in the neighborhood started small. "The Millers have the best AC in the county," a neighbor joked over a picket fence. But the humor died when the frost reached the basement windows. Passers-by started noticing the condensation on the exterior brickwork, a thick fog clinging to the house while the rest of the street shimmered in heat waves. Elias tried to call the city, but the clerk on the other end laughed him off. "A glacier in your basement, Mr. Miller?" Maybe check for a refrigerant leak. The injustice of being ignored fueled his obsession. He bought a thermal scanner, a professional-grade unit used for bridge inspections. When he pointed it at the north wall, the screen didn't just show blue. It turned a bruised, violent purple. The temperature behind the concrete was 60 degrees below zero. The human texture of the house began to change. Elias and his wife, Sarah, moved their lives to the second floor, abandoned the kitchen as the floorboards began to warp and groan. The smell of the house transformed from the scent of cinnamon and laundry to a crisp, metallic ozone, the smell of a high-altitude mountain peak. Every night, the house spoke. It was a series of sharp cracks and deep, resonant booms that sounded like a ship breaking up in an ice flow. The curiosity loop was a freezing one. How could a house built on temperate, suburban clay be experiencing a glacial event? Elias spent his nights in the garage, poring over geological maps of the region. He found a footnote from 1922 about an anomalous deep-core frost pocket discovered by a drilling crew 3 miles away. It had been dismissed as a data error. The escalation reached a tipping point on a Friday evening. Elias was in the basement, wearing his heavy winter parka and work boots, watching a laser level he'd mounted to the floor. The red line jumped. Then it swung wide. A loud, wet crunch echoed through the room. A slab of ice, ancient and translucent blue, forced its way through the concrete like a slow-motion wrecking ball. It brought with it a surge of pressurized air that smelled of ancient rot and frozen earth. Leo stood at the top of the stairs, his face pale. "Dad, the yard is freezing," the boy whispered. Elias ran outside. In the middle of the parched brown lawn, the grass was turning white. A circle of frost was expanding from the house, killing the flowers, turning the soil into iron. The pacing of the disaster was agonizingly slow. It wasn't a sudden flood or a fire. It was a creeping, silent conquest. The miller's home was being physically dismantled by a force of nature that defied the calendar. Elias watched as the local news vans finally arrived, their cameras capturing the surreal sight of a suburban home encased in a shroud of ice while the reporters wiped sweat from their brows. The underdog story hit the airwaves, the engineer who warned everyone, now watching his life's work crushed by a prehistoric ghost. The curiosity loop tightened. What was inside the ice? As the pressure continued to build, the ice didn't just stop at the walls. It pushed upward, cracking the floorboards of the living room, lifting the dining table toward the ceiling. By midnight, the authorities had evacuated the entire block. The basement glacial rupture was no longer a domestic issue. It was a geological anomaly of global proportions. Elias stood across the street, his arm around Sarah, watching the blue light of the police cruisers bounce off the frozen windows of his home. The house was humming, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the teeth of everyone standing on the sidewalk. A geologist from the state university arrived, looking at the thermal readings with wide, terrified eyes. "It's not just ice," she told Elias, her voice barely a whisper. "It's a trapped pocket of the Pleistocene. You didn't just have a leak. You pierced a pressurized atmospheric vault." The revelation was a punch to the gut. The house hadn't been built on a solid foundation. It had been built on a geological bubble, a freak pocket of the Ice Age that had been sealed under a cap of impenetrable clay for 10,000 years. The construction of the miller's basement, specifically the deep-set pylons Elias had installed for a home gym, had acted as a needle, popping a balloon that had been under immense pressure for millennia. The injustice was the random cruelty of it. Of all the lots, in all the towns, the rupture happened under their dinner table. The momentum of the night shifted from rescue to containment. They weren't trying to save the house anymore. They were trying to prevent the rupture from destabilizing the entire neighborhood. As the first act ends, the miller's home sits like a jagged blue diamond under the moonlight. The heat of the Ohio summer is powerless against it. The ice has filled the entire first floor now, a solid, unmoving mass that has turned a family home into a monument of the deep past. The final curiosity loop remains open. If the air inside that ice is 10,000 years old, what else is being carried to the surface in the surge? Elias watches as a crack forms in the ice near the front door. Something dark is frozen inside the translucent blue. It's not a rock, and it's not wood. It looks like a feather. A very large, very ancient feather. The silence of the neighborhood is broken only by the sound of the house finally giving up, the roof joist snapping as the glacier claims its new territory. The heat of the following morning was a cruel joke. While the rest of Ohio suffered under a record-breaking sun, the Miller's Street had become an Arctic dead zone. The humidity from the surrounding blocks hit the invisible wall of cold and condensed into a thick, swirling fog that swallowed the house entirely. Elias stood behind the yellow police tape, his breath hitching in white puffs. He was watching a team of specialists in specialized, thick insulated hazmat suits disappear into the mist. They weren't just carrying Geiger counters. They were carrying industrial heaters and seismic sensors. The momentum of the crisis had shifted. It was no longer a matter of a broken foundation. It was a matter of a biological and geological anomaly that the world wasn't prepared to handle. The human texture of the scene was one of clinical, detached fascination. National news crews set up their tripods just inches from the frost line, their reporters wearing parkas while standing on sun-baked asphalt. The bystander gossip had turned sharp and fearful. "It's a government experiment gone wrong," one man whispered to a small crowd. They were testing cryo-storage in the old salt mines. But Elias knew the truth was far more ancient. He watched as a flatbed truck arrived, carrying massive, industrial-grade liquid nitrogen tanks. They weren't trying to melt the ice, they were trying to stabilize it. The revelation from the state geologist echoed in his mind. The pressure from the underground vault was so immense that if the ice melted too quickly, the entire subdivision would be sucked into a subterranean sinkhole. Elias, fueled by the injustice of being barred from his own life, found a way back in. He knew the drainage tunnels that ran beneath the neighborhood like a concrete nervous system. He crawled through the dark, damp pipes, the temperature dropping with every meter he moved toward his home. When he finally emerged through a maintenance hatch in his own garage, the sight stopped his heart. The floor was gone. In its place was a jagged vertical canyon of ice that glowed with an internal sapphire light. The glacial rupture had carved a path straight down into the earth. The silence was absolute, a heavy, pressurized quiet that felt like being at the bottom of the ocean. He moved toward the edge of the abyss. The air was so cold it burned his throat, smelling of ozone and something metallic, the scent of air that hadn't been breathed in 10 millennia. The curiosity loop tightened as he looked into the translucent wall of the glacier. Frozen within the blue depths weren't just rocks or soil. He saw shapes. High-definition, perfectly preserved forms of flora that didn't belong in the 21st century. Giant, fern-like leaves with serrated edges and flowers that looked like crystalline bells. But the real escalation, the thing that made him stumble back, was the dark shape he had seen from the outside. It wasn't a feather. It was a wing. Frozen 3 feet into the ice was a creature that defied modern biology. It was avian but massive, its feathers a deep, iridescent charcoal. The beak was hooked and obsidian black, and its eyes, wide and golden, seemed to stare through the ice with an intelligence that felt ancient and predatory. The injustice of the discovery hit Elias like a physical blow. This wasn't just a geological event, it was a mass grave. His basement had breached a pocket where an entire ecosystem had been flash frozen in a localized atmospheric collapse. He was standing in a prehistoric morgue, and the pressure from below was still pushing more of it toward the surface. The pacing of the surge increased. A deep, resonant groan vibrated through the garage floor. Elias watched as a new crack spidered across the ice. A pocket of trapped air hissed out, a sound like 1,000 whispers. The smell changed instantly, a cloying, heavy scent of musk and ancient decay. The others were coming up. As the ice pushed further into the garage, more shapes appeared. The curved tusk of a juvenile mastodon, the claw of something that looked like a giant ground sloth. The miller's home was becoming a museum of the dead, a physical manifestation of a world that had ended 10,000 years ago. The tension outside was reaching a breaking point. The industrial heaters weren't working. The cold was moving through the ground, freezing the water lines and snapping gas pipes. The neighborhood was being reclaimed by a season that hadn't existed in Ohio since the dawn of man. Elias realized that the rupture wasn't just a leak. It was a rebalancing. The earth was exhaling a breath it had held for eons, and his house was the mouth. The underdog wasn't just his family anymore. It was the entire town of Oak Creek. A scientist in a thermal suit suddenly appeared in the garage doorway, his visor fogging over. He didn't yell. His voice was small and filled with a terrifying awe. "Get out of here, Elias. The pressure is redlining. The clay cap is failing." The escalation was no longer creeping. It was erupting. The garage floor tilted at a 45-degree angle as the glacier heaved upward, a massive, slow-motion tidal wave of blue ice. The sound was like a mountain being ground into dust. Elias scrambled back through the hatch, the cold nipping at his heels like a living thing. As he looked back one last time, he saw the ancient bird's wings shift. It wasn't moving because it was alive. It was moving because the ice was shattering. The atmosphere inside the pocket was being released into the 2024 heat wave, a collision of worlds that was creating a localized weather system of blinding snow and screaming winds inside his suburban home. The act ends with Elias bursting out into the humid Ohio night, falling onto the hot asphalt and looking back to see a blizzard raging inside the ruins of his garage. The mystery of what lies at the bottom of the vault is still descending, and the ground is beginning to shake. The final act was a slow-motion surrender to the inevitable. By the third week of the crisis, the Millers' home had become a sapphire cathedral, a jagged monolith of ice that had completely replaced the domestic architecture of their lives. The authorities had long since stopped trying to save the structure. The mission had pivoted to a grim surgical containment. The injustice of the situation peaked when Elias was officially informed that his home would be demolished not by wrecking balls, but by a controlled thermal collapse. They had to liquefy the upper layers while simultaneously sealing the breach in the clay cap with thousands of tons of quick-dry geological grout. The human texture of the final day was marked by a heavy, funeral-like silence. The neighbors, who had once gossiped over fences, now stood at the edge of the exclusion zone in a somber vigil. Sarah Miller held a small box, the few items Elias had managed to grab during his final illicit crawl through the vents. A wedding album, a handful of Leo's drawings, and a single, frozen, bell-shaped flower Elias had plucked from the glacier. The sensory details of the demolition were jarring. There was no explosion, just the deafening hiss of industrial steam injectors and the low guttural roar of the earth finally reclaiming its breath. As the grout was pumped into the abyss, the pressure from the ancient vault gave one last, violent heave. The ice shattered with a sound like 1,000 windows breaking at once. For a fleeting second, the prehistoric wing Elias had seen was thrust upward, its iridescent feathers catching the harsh Ohio sun before being buried forever under a sea of gray concrete. The revelation of the basement glacial rupture didn't just end with the destruction of a house. It ended with the permanent abandonment of the Oak Creek subdivision. The geological survey determined that the entire ridge was a honeycomb of these pressurized pockets. The world wasn't safe to build on. The legacy of the Miller family became a haunting footnote in geological history. They were the underdogs who had survived a prehistoric assault, but the aftermath showed the true impact of the twist. They received a settlement, yes, but no check could buy back the feeling of solid ground beneath their feet. Elias spent his first night in a rental apartment 3 towns away, unable to sleep. He found himself walking to the kitchen, his bare feet treading lightly on the linoleum, terrified that he would feel a familiar, sharp chill rising through the floor. The pacing of his recovery was measured in months of looking at the ground, waiting for a crack that never came. The story concludes, not with a triumph, but with a quiet, lingering mystery. Years later, scientists still visit the Oak Creek exclusion zone, a flat, gravel-covered lot where the Millers' home once stood. Despite the global warming trends and the scorching summer heat, the ground there remains perpetually cold. Sometimes, after a heavy rain, small shards of blue ice still push their way through the gravel, exhaling the scent of an ancient world that refuses to stay buried. The curiosity loop remains half open. What else is down there, waiting for the next pylon to pierce the veil? Elias Miller never looked at a blueprint the same way again. He understood now that human progress is just a thin crust over a deep, frozen past. The basement glacial rupture was a reminder that we are all just tenants on a planet that has a very long memory. The final image of the story is Elias standing in his new backyard, watching his son Leo play in the grass. The boy stops, looking down at his feet for a moment, with a look of sudden, sharp focus. He looks up at his father and smiles, but Elias doesn't smile back. He just watches the grass, waiting for the first sign of frost. The Millers thought they were building a future, but they accidentally opened a door to a frozen past. If the mystery of the basement glacier chilled you to the bone, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the anomalies that hide beneath our feet. Tell us in the comments, what's the strangest thing you've ever found in your foundation? Until next time, stay safe and watch where you dig. The Millers spent their lives building a home on what they thought was solid ground, only to find out the Earth has a long, cold memory. If this descent into the prehistoric depths of the basement glacial rupture gripped you, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the anomalies that defy science. Drop a comment below if your foundation started breathing 10,000-year-old air. Would you run, or would you look inside? Your engagement helps us bring these hidden mysteries to light. Disclaimer: the following program is produced for entertainment purposes only. The Basement Glacial Rupture is a dramatized narrative inspired by geological anomalies and speculative science. Names, characters, locations, and specific events have been fictionalized for storytelling purposes. This content should not be used as a substitute for professional engineering, geological advice, or emergency safety protocols. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or real-world property disputes is purely coincidental. Viewers are advised to consult local building codes and geological surveys for factual information regarding their own property.